If you've watched Better Call Saul, then you most likely know what's going on here. More specifically, you might know what this shot in particular means. Something has just happened to Jimmy, a situation or circumstance, favorable or not, which he seems to have accepted. He's made a decision and peacefully walked away. We cut to the shot in question. Jimmy walks towards the camera, slowly filling up the frame until the shot is medium to close. He contemplates something, the gears spinning in his mind as he struggles with himself. All throughout the shot, he seems to be mostly leaning towards the left side of the frame. A few seconds of internal struggling later, he turns around and walks back where he came, reversing whatever decision he previously made and doing something totally unexpected, something almost totally unpredictable. In this scene in particular, Jimmy has just applied to a job as a copy machine salesman at Neff Copiers. Having recently had his license suspended and very recently after Chuck's death, Jimmy aims to find something to keep him busy. But when he applies for the position the good old-fashioned way, the employers say they'll contact him within the week. The interviews seem to have gone fine, nothing out the ordinary, and Jimmy leaves. But in this moment, he impulsively turns around and walks back into the office. He pitches a long, dramatic, theatrical speech, winning over the employers with razzle-dazzle, honeyed words, and empty promises. And surprise, surprise, they hire him on the spot. But when that happens, Jimmy switches up completely. He's pissed that they got swayed so easily. No background checks, no guarantees, no nothing, just won over by his shiny words and flashy personality. He mocks them and leaves in a huff. From the beginning of the series, even when Jimmy is still walking the straight and narrow prior to his transformation into Saul, we can see obvious signs of the charming yet devious, chaotic, living in the moment trickster that is Slippin' Jimmy. Jimmy is a chaotic, impulsive force right from the beginning, but during the start of the show, the mild-mannered, well-meaning side tries to quell the impulsiveness, the discordant thoughts, the mood shifts, and the sudden decisions. But even if Jimmy manages to hide it at times, we can always see that unpredictability. In this scene in season 4, this chaos is on full display, what with Jimmy having had his whole life uprooted. Everything is a mess in Jimmy's life at the moment, and the hectic nature of things leads to this very well-written display of the true chaos in Jimmy's heart. The rashness and the internal struggle of huckster versus straight man, of Jimmy versus Saul. And that's one of the things I love the most about this show, something that I didn't fully accept until the show had ended and I could see the full trajectory of Jimmy's character arc. And it's the fact that the writers did what I think is one of the hardest things in writing. They wrote a chaotic, unpredictable character that made sense. But, as I've said, while this instance at Neff Copiers is merely the most obvious, most well-crafted display of Jimmy's unpredictability, it's not his first, and perhaps not even his most chaotic outburst. To me, the most outwardly visible of that internal struggle takes place at the end of season 1, particularly in episode 10, in what I believe is one of the coolest episodes and yet one that struck me as one of the weakest when I had first seen it. After learning that Chuck doesn't believe Jimmy has grown out of his slippin' ways and that he doesn't think of him as a real lawyer, Jimmy soon after suffers a mental breakdown during a game of bingo at the retirement home, and in the spur of the moment travels back to his hometown of Cicero. Now for the rest of this episode and the one after it, episode 1 of season 2, Jimmy pulls off a series of impulsive decisions or quick changes of the mind in quick succession. Let's say that the first is Jimmy's decision to go back to Cicero directly after his bingo breakdown. Once in Cicero, Jimmy goes on a week-long scamming binge with his friend and old partner in crime, Marco. But when Marco suffers a heart attack and suddenly dies, Jimmy gets a call from Kim, who has set up a job interview for him at Davis and Maine. Jimmy decides to come back. A good decision, but a sudden one nevertheless, so we'll call that number 2. Arriving back at Albuquerque, Jimmy makes his way to the courthouse, practicing how he'll greet his potential new employer, Cliff Maine. But in that moment, he hesitates, as the ring he's wearing, the memento left behind from Marco, serves as a reminder. It reawakens the struggle. Does Jimmy really want to go back on the straight path, do things the right way, ignore what he's really good at? Jimmy walks into the courthouse, and after ensuring that his decision has no bearing on his future relationship with Kim, he turns down the job. That's our third impulsive decision. He gets in his car and leaves, apparently having decided that he's never going to let that internal struggle stop him from doing what he wants ever again.
It's never stopping me again.
But in season 2, after a few days of chilling and scamming, Jimmy realizes that he needs to return to reality, to Kim, and after a few seconds of contemplation, calls Davis and Maine. He accepts the job. That is impulsive decision 4. Over the course of the season 1 finale and season 2's first episode, Jimmy seems to make 4 impulsive decisions in quick succession, flitting from one side to the next as if with the wind. He's at his most impulsive and chaotic here. Now, the reason that I thought these 2 episodes were some of the weakest when I first saw them was because of this very thing. It was because of Jimmy's unpredictability, him making decisions and walking back on them almost immediately without much changing in the grand scheme of things. It seemed abrupt, a little immediate. It seemed like a rush to end the first season on a Saul-esque bang, at a time when Jimmy's full transition into Saul had yet to be earned. And the beginning of the next season seemed like an immediate reversion of that. Like the writers immediately walked back that decision and allowed him to go back on it to work at Davis and Maine. Finishing the series gave me a different perspective, though. Over the course of the next few seasons, Jimmy's rashness and unpredictability was further expanded upon. It was more clearly highlighted. It started to make sense. Jimmy's unpredictability and inconsistency started to become consistent. You could count on Jimmy to change his mind in the spur of the moment or to do something totally unexpected, the total opposite of what he'd said or done a few seconds prior. That's where the shot I mentioned at the beginning of the video comes back into play. We have a similar shot in the car prior to him deciding to quit Davis and Maine. We have one immediately after the bar license reinstatement meeting, where he suddenly decides to stay and wait. We have one prior to the boxing match with Howard, where he decides to go for it after having initially turned down the challenge. And we have another functionally similar shot when Gene gets made and almost asks for a new identity again until he suddenly says,
I've changed my mind.
We grow to expect this behavior from Jimmy, this chaotic impulsivity, and it makes the first season finale's choices and subsequent reversions make sense in hindsight. Peter Gould and Vince Gilligan themselves have briefly mentioned what brought upon this suddenality in the season 1 finale. Primarily, Gilligan and Gould's initial plan with the show had them rushing to get to Saul. In a sense, they feared people would be uninterested in Jimmy, and they felt like they owed it to the studio and the viewers to get him there as quick as possible, to get him to the point that we're familiar with. But along the way, a lot changed, and they realized that they could take their time, that they could build out Jimmy, that there's not much to be done when you get to Saul, who is a character at the peak of his powers, if you will, smooth, smart, relaxed, and at peace with his corruption. They realized that they didn't want to lose Jimmy anymore. Then, lo and behold, season after season went by and it dawned on us, we don't want to get to Saul Goodman, and that's the tragedy. That's why after season 1 they realized they could slow things down and give the transition more time. Moreover, Kim's effect on Jimmy and Ray Seahorn's magnificent performance in the role over the course of the first season had reshaped the trajectory of the story. This woman in Jimmy's life, who initially didn't have much central importance, had developed into a very crucial part of it over the course of the first season, and the writers realized that Jimmy would not step away from her so easily, which is what influences his decision to come back in the first episode of season 2. And thus, Jimmy's depiction and growth over the rest of the series, and the writers' commentary on their thought process during that first season and how their vision of the show evolved, paints us a picture of why in those 2 episodes, Jimmy was that unpredictable. But the most interesting part about this, to me, is that these very talented writers managed to utilize this messiness in Jimmy's character in the aftermath. They managed to write his evolution throughout the rest of the series in a manner that makes his actions in those 2 episodes more believable and more justified, and no longer as sudden and abrupt as they felt in the moment. His impulsiveness and rashness later on in the series explains the chaos that he displayed there, firmly connecting it it altogether. But it doesn't become clear how consistent Jimmy's unpredictability is until the series finale. After finally getting caught as Gene, Saul manages to reduce his sentence down to only 7 years. But when he realizes that Kim had confessed to sabotaging Howard and he realizes how much guilt she still harbors, he pretends that he has more information to confess about Howard's murder, which leads to her showing up to his hearing. There, Jimmy starts off playing the victim once again, but suddenly he switches up. He confesses everything, throwing the courtroom into chaos as he reiterates how crucial he was to Heisenberg. And that is Jimmy's final bout of unpredictability, his final major impulsive change, even if it originally takes place in the plane where he first seemed to cook up the plan. It's a surprise to all around him, as after all he'd done, after being so close to freedom, after having so fully embraced Saul, that he would switch up one last time. But as viewers, we know Jimmy is unpredictable, we know he's surprising, and how well this notion is established makes this final switch up all the more sensical. For more reason than one, it is the ultimate fulfillment of his character arc, as it all comes back in a full circle to his actions in the season 1 finale. Jimmy is unpredictable, but where Kim is involved, we can be sure that every time he'll circle back to doing the right thing. Thank you so much for watching. I just recently finished Better Call Saul, and I was truly impressed with how Gould, Gilligan, and the rest of the writer's room handled this character's fascinating transformation. But what I admired even more was how well they managed to write such a chaotic character. There's truly so much to learn there. But anyways, if you enjoyed this video essay and want to see more like it, consider leaving a like and subscribing. I appreciate ya. Take care.